start, I just want to give a quick disclaimer. I'm using the closed captioning for Google Slides. So if it doesn't accurately represent what I'm saying, like that might happen because the closed captioning won't pick up like everything that I say correctly. Um, we'll move on. And before I start off with the presentation, I'm going to read this land acknowledgement. The UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. The university was built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We are honored to share this space with them, and we thank them for their stewardship. And this was adapted from the UCSD Intertribal Resource Center. And if you're not currently an SD, I really recommend that you look into whose land you're currently occupying and how you can support their movements. I also want to have another moment of silence, or a moment of silence in remembrance of George Floyd. Today is the 1 year anniversary of his murder at the hands of like state-sanctioned violence, and we'll start a moment of silence now. To set the tone for the presentation, here are some community guidelines. So first off, this is a brave space. I hope that we can all lean into like any discomfort if we feel any throughout the presentation, and we kind of like learn and grow from that. And then this is also or the Vegas rule. So whatever happens here stays here, like whatever we learn here, you can share with others, but like any personal stories that folks may have, just keep it within this space. And another one is make space, take space, while also keeping in mind your positionality. So I don't know if you realize that you're maybe like taking up too much space. Also, like I really like encourage folks to like put your thoughts out there, but also to make space for other folks. And I am gonna have some discussion questions, so I really hope that y'all participate and engage with me. I can't see any of your faces, but hopefully I get to hear your thoughts. Um, and just as like a reminder, when you're typing in a question or like a comment, go ahead and set it to like panelists and all attendees so that everyone else in this space can get to hear your thoughts or read your thoughts. A brief overview is we're going to be covering the history of the labor movement. It's not going to be a very like deep history because that take a very long time, but we'll cover some very key points within the movement. Then we'll be going over oppression within labor movements, so how even within these like labor organizing spaces, folks still like operate within these systems of oppression. And lastly, we'll be going over like key labor movements that have happened and are happening now for queer, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and for women. All right. If y'all could, or if y'all want to like introduce yourselves, just your name, your pronouns, why you're here. Yeah, I can start off. So my name is Sara Guzman. My pronouns are she, they. I'm currently a third year majoring in political science and soon to be ethnic studies. And I'm here because I truly believe that like the labor movement or labor organizing is very key to reaching liberation for like all folks. Let me, oops, my bad, y'all. And again, as a reminder, just make sure you have your chat settings to all panelists and attendees. I'm gonna give it like a minute or so, and if folks don't have a chance to introduce themselves right now, you can do so like anytime throughout this presentation. Oh, okay. My name is Violeta, pronoun she, her, hers. My father was a union labor organizer. He was very passionate about it, and I'm interested in learning more. I'm Grayson. I use they, them pronouns. I'm here because liberation is the goal I have for my loved ones around the world. What we do is a deep part of this, and everything we do is essentially labor. Definitely. Edwina, she, her, and interested in how labor and racism intersect. Okay, and that's something we'll definitely be going over during this presentation. Okay, I'm gonna move on, but if folks still want to keep like introducing themselves, feel free to do so. Okay. All right. So we're gonna be going over like what labor movements are like briefly, and by definition, it's an organized political movement that aims to improve the rights and working conditions of the working people through collective action. And it's often led by labor unions that organize these workers, but it doesn't necessarily have to do so. It's happened every so often where there is like a wildcat strike, which is when workers go on strike without, I guess, being authorized to do so. And a labor union, also like a very brief definition, is an organization that serves as a middle person between the members, which are like the workers, and the employer. And an example is with the labor union AFSCME 3299 and the University of California. And not every business, but most businesses, like large corporations, do have unions. Another union would be like Teamsters or the UAW, etc. And just a quick stat for year 2020, there was only about 11% of wage and salary workers that were members of unions. And we'll go more into like how these statistics break apart, but about 35% come from the public sector. So like teachers, for example, versus only 6%, around 6% that come from the private sector. In some historical context, uh, I want to, yeah, I want to go into like settler colonialism, which is the accumulation of land through the displacement of indigenous people. The United States is a settler colonial state, and it is an ongoing process. But in order for capitalists and well, colonizers to profit off of the land, it's necessary to first of all like accumulate the land through the displacement of indigenous people and have people to work the land in order for them to be making a profit off of. off of them, right? And that's where racial capitalism comes in, which is the process of deriving value from the racial identity of others. An example of this would be chattel slavery. Capitalism already thrives off of inequalities in order to like exploit the working class, and racism only like exact or amplifies that, and that way the state is able to capitalize off of Black, Indigenous people of color. And white supremacy, patriarchy, neoliberalism are only these are only more systems that allow for further exploitation of these communities. And due to racial capitalism, there is such thing as like gendered and like racial like job categories or racialized job categories. For example, like the stereotype of when you think of like a farm worker or a service worker, you think of a Black or brown person. And that is due to racial capitalism and systems that have prevented these communities from accessing other types of like careers or jobs. And in this document here, it's honestly a very like small document, very hard to read, but there are portions of it that show the statistics of people of the job categories within the Angola prison, which used to be it was a plantation, and then when that was quote unquote like illegal, then they moved it into a like a prison, and here it's like the same people, the same the plantation owners were basically running it, and most of the people in the prison were Black and brown, and these people that were incarcerated were often used were often leased to private companies, and were doing much of the same labor that they were doing um, like when slavery was technically legal. And here you can also see how most of the people that were doing laundry or working in the dining halls, most of the percentage, it was like over 90% Black, and people that were working in the cotton fields were also mostly, if not all, Black folks. And here's a brief timeline of the early labor movement. In 1648, the shoemakers and coopers, which were like barrel makers, they were it's one of the first recorded like groups to organize, and this was happening in Boston. Although it wasn't a formal union, they were actually guilds, but they essentially provided the same thing. Like they were fighting for livable wages and like health benefits for the workers. In 1768, the New York tailors, they had a strike to protest a wage cut. In 1774, the Philadelphia shoemakers reorganized as the Federal Society of Journeymen Cordwainers, and this was one of the first, like very like huge and recognized like labor groups. In 1825, women formed their first union, and it was the United Tailoresses of New York. In 1953, American the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organization merged into one large labor organization. And in 1968, there was the sanitation worker strike, which I will be covering in the later part of the presentation. And in 1970, the UFW started their 5-year boycott, I believe. And again, this is very brief. There's so much that has happened between these dates. It's just there's a lot of information that I'd have to cover in order to do that. And next, I'd also I'm gonna go back. I would like to point out that most of this history is very white, and it's like the resources that are most like famous, or the ones that you see pop up the most, are the ones that are covering this very like white labor history, which is why I'm gonna play this video where this person goes over the labor movement, but focusing on Black organizers. And it's about 3 minutes long.
Labor Day is a time to recognize the American labor movement. You know, the contributions that workers have made to this country. Newsflash, Black labor built this country. After slaves were legally freed in 1865, Black folks had a hell of a time finding employment, joining unions, and eventually the labor movement. Because, yeah, the history of labor in America is racist as food. Labor Day became a federal holiday in 1894 after a strike led by the American Railway Union, known as the Pullman Strike. This was a turning point in the labor movement, though it didn't benefit all American workers. Black Pullman porters weren't allowed to participate in the strike because they were not allowed in the unions, but they wanted to be. Black people were organizing unions way back then, too. Some scholars even date Black unions to as early as 1838. And in 1865, some African Americans were in white collar professions like doctors and lawyers, while some free men filled blue collar jobs like artisans, farm workers, laborers, servants, and caulkers. Speaking of ship caulkers, this is Isaac Myers. Born a free man in Baltimore in 1835, he started working as a ship caulker at 16. In the late 1850s, the white caulkers went on strike and even rioted against the well unionized black caulkers, who were sometimes paid more than them because of collective bargaining with Baltimore shipyard owners. Ultimately, the shipyards fired about 1,000 black workers, including Myers. Isaac Myers and other African American laborers organized a black run cooperative shipyard, the Chesapeake Marine Railway, and the Dry Dock Company. And they essentially employed themselves. Entrepreneurship, y'all. 300 black workers were employed through this cooperative. The shipyard was leased for 20 years, then it was returned to its owner. This success eventually led to one of the first national black labor organizations, the Colored National Labor Union. Myers became its first president in 1869. Their demands were simple: improve work conditions, eliminate discrimination within unions, and develop a national system of public education with equal opportunities for blacks. Over 200 delegates attended the first CNLU convention in 1869, and two representatives met with President Ulysses S. Grant. Frederick Douglass became their second president in 1872. But the CNLU soon dissolved after becoming divided over supporting the Republican Party or the National Labor Reform Party. Though the CNLU existed for less than 5 years, it led to the incorporation of black workers into white labor unions like the Knights of Labor. It also paved the way for black labor unions like the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Established by A. Philip Randolph in 1925, this was the first African American union to receive a charter in the American Federation of Labor, which later became the AFL-CIO. Randolph went on to become an outspoken leader in the civil rights movement. Finally, the work of black labor unions was recognized. Well, kind of, sort of. This is America, y'all.
Okay, there we go. All right. And here is another brief timeline. Some of it is what she covered in her video, and some of it I added. But here in 1850, the American League of Colored Laborers was established. 1869, the Colored National Labor Union was established, and this is what she was mentioning in the video. In 1881, 3,000 Black women that were laundry workers staged one of the largest protests in Atlanta, Atlanta, Georgia. And I'll also go more into detail about this in my later part of the presentation. In 1905, the Industrial Workers of the World was established, and this was one of the first unions that, like, it was one of the policies that they had when they were first founded, and it stated that anyone, like, no matter what race or ethnicity you were welcome into this union or into this labor organization, and women were actually also welcomed into this organization as well. And in 1925, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was established, and this was the first, like, official union that was actually recognized. And in 1963, there was the March on Washington, and this was like a large march that was happening for economic and racial justice. And in 1968, the sanitation workers' strike happened, which was mentioned in the other timeline. We're going to go back to the white history of the labor movements, but it's also very essential. So the Knights of Labor were one of the first national labor organizations. It was founded in 1869, and it wasn't like a large like union or like a labor organization. It was very much like a secretive organization, and it was organizing tailor workers in Philadelphia. This particular organization was open to workers of any kind. It welcomed like craft workers or unskilled laborers, but of course, like this was like to a certain degree. I'll go more into that later. But only white men were actually being welcomed into this labor organization. But the Knights of Labor were is the organization that's like known for first fighting for the 8-hour day, for like livable wages, for no child labor, and for the 5-day week. Their I guess their organizing strategies were like interesting because they refused to engage in strikes. They rather like bargain or like have peaceful negotiations with their workers. And eventually, the membership for the Knights of Labor began to die down, and the American Federation of Labor kind of took over as the nation's largest union organization. And eventually, when they merged with the CIO, then they were definitely the largest nationally. And this graph just shows like 8 hour the 8-hour workday, just to have 8 hours to rest. And even then, I know many people who don't just work 8 hours a day. They have to like work overtime in order to actually be able to survive. Yeah, the Haymarket strike was is another like iconic like labor action, I'd say. It happened May 4th of 1886, and people talk about it a lot when we get close to like to May Day, which is on May 1st, and it happened in Chicago's Haymarket Square. There was there was already May Day rallies happening before the Haymarket strike. However, the or a labor protester was murdered by the police during like one of the rallies, and the Haymarket strike was in response to that. It resulted in like the decreasing membership for the Knights of Labor because there was like over 200, there's maybe like around 300 protesters that showed up, and someone from the crowd threw a bomb at like a group of policemen, and the policemen didn't actually know who it came from, but they just started shooting into the crowd, and 8 people actually like ended up dying. There was around 8 people arrested from the actual like from the actual action that was happening there, but 7 of them were actually convicted, and then one of them ended up committing suicide in jail. And it was they weren't the only ones that were arrested. Like the days following, many other labor organizers were arrested, despite having no like clear connection to even being at the Haymarket Square when this happened. After this, there was like very much of a rise in anti-labor organizing or anti-unions. There is also very much like an anti-German sentiment because many of the German like working class were very radical at this time. And strikes like these have inspired other strikes up until now. So on May 1st, there was the huge immigrant strike of 2006, and or around like 2 million people across the US were protesting in response to like poor working conditions, especially for immigrants and undocumented folks. It wasn't just a strike, but it was also a boycott just to prove how essential undocumented people are to the productivity, I guess, of this country. And along with all the like anti-labor organizing sentiments that were happening. To this day, there's also very much anti-union propaganda. And not just propaganda, but also policies that harm workers. So here, it's a very old, like political cartoon, but it's it shows the AS the American Federation of Labor shooting like a cannon into the government building, and it's kind of showing how like all the demands that these workers are demanding are actually destroying like the government. And here are some other like news articles that I found. There's this one thing like, why are unions harmful to workers? And the one at the top says Delta urges workers to pay for video games, not union dues. Kind of just insinuating that like a video game would be more beneficial to you than actually having to pay for your union dues. There's a couple more that I wanted to show. Um, the picture to the left, the one in black and white for that says "I am a man." This was from the sanitation workers strike, and the one on the right happened last year during the cost of living adjustment movement. And you can see how well there's on the right. I'm assuming it's like the National Guard or like the military that was sent in response to the strikes. And for the cola movement, it was also state police that were sent to kind of like control the protesters. And many in both in both actions, many people were arrested. Like nothing has really changed in the government's response to people demanding livable wages and like decent health benefits. And at the bottom, it's more Amazon anti-union propaganda. So it's there. This is actually legal. Like companies are able to discourage workers from joining unions. And in this case, Amazon's being like, hey, like you can save $500 per year if you don't join the union. And kind of like there's no point in joining the union because we're already offering all these other benefits. Okay, and I'm gonna play a short video. I saw this circulating on Twitter and I thought it was really funny, but
This is clear.
so it's John Oliver and it's one of the games I guess that Jimmy is it Fallon? Yeah, has with like his contestants, and at this time it's Alexa, I believe.
Really not a commercial for this.
Oh, in which case, I've got another one. Alexa, how bad are Amazon working conditions?
Alexa, stop. Sure. Alexa, stop. Here we go. All right,
No,
I have to.
Alexa. No, Alexa. Alexa, what is union
No, Alexa,
busting?
this is me time now. Alexa, stop. Stop, please. Alexa, please listen to me. All right, I have to get to say.
You can find the rest of it on YouTube, but it was just that short clip that was very like important, I guess. So just bringing up like labor organizing and the union busting that Amazon has been known for on an entertainment show like the Jimmy Fallon show, and the way he reacted, like he was not with like talking about Amazon's union busting, and I didn't know that this anti-union propaganda had such a big I guess impact or influence on the entertainment industry. And a question for y'all is, have you ever seen, experienced, or even heard of union busting? And why do you think that corporations would want to like stop unions, union bust, or prevent their workers from asking for like livable wages? And I'm gonna give y'all a couple minutes to process this question. Yes, Jacqueline, Delta is definitely trash for like sending anti-union messages like that. And Jacqueline says, I used to work at Ralph's, a telecom, and for corporations to be anti-union. They want to profit off people in all ways possible, as not all of us know our rights. Unions help us build our understanding of how we can stand up to these profit-eating monsters. Yeah, that's definitely another thing. I feel like many companies don't actually tell you or tell their workers what their rights are, like who they can like address when, or who they can go up to when they're having issues with their employees or employers. Right, I'm gonna give it one more minute if folks are still like processing this question or are currently typing. I've never like personally experienced any sort of union busting, but yeah, I've just seen the like what I've seen online, just the anti-union propaganda that companies like Amazon and Walmart have been like putting out towards the workers. Mm, right, I'm gonna continue, but if anyone was typing like a comment out, you can go ahead and still put it in the chat. Oops. Okay. There it is. So the power of union labor organizing. Uh, a lot of companies union bust because having to pay their workers like livable wages or having to pay for health benefits or like shorter work days does raise the cost for these capitalists. They're actually not gonna like it's not like they're gonna be losing money by providing livable wages, but the amount of profits that they make, which is a lot compared to the profits that we make, will go down. And labor organizing also forces like CEOs or company owners to have to share power with their employees. So unions or labor organizing, it does kind of it messes up that hierarchy that keeps capitalists in power because then employees actually like they have a say in how much they want to get paid, how much like overtime they want to get, etc. It gives employees it gives employers like an actual like voice. And also when when one person stands up to the big boss, then they can easily get fired. But when it's, let's say, like half the company that's saying, hey, I want to get paid more, then it makes their voices a lot more powerful. And this quote is like, they can't fire all of us. This political cartoon also shows like all these like it's like over a dozen workers, and then with collective action it turns into like this big fist that can take that can succeed in like having livable wages. And despite like all this anti-union or anti-labor sentiment, there have been a variety of like policy wins that stem from the labor movements and the efforts and labor that folks have put into this movement. Uh, the main ones that I kind of want to highlight are the National Labor Relations Act and the Railway Labor Act, which really gave folks the right to like join unions and be able to organize without any serious like consequences. Although like police is still sent to break strikes, right? And there's also the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, which established the 40-hour work week, and it imposed overtime pay requirements on employers for like for most types of work in as long as it like exceeded the 40-hour work week. There's also the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act, which all kind of ensured that everyone or folks within the same occupation were getting paid around the same amounts. And another big one was or recently, and I believe it was last year, the Bostock versus Clayton County, and and the judges decided that the Civil Rights Act did protect like gay and trans people within employment. And there's also another policy that's currently being pushed, which is the Equality Act. Next, we'll be discussing systems of oppression within the labor movement. There's always been discrimination within labor unions, especially like at the beginning, but um, historically, labor unions have been reserved for white, like cishet men. Excuse me. And an example of this is the Knights of Labor prohibited women and Black people from joining the union for about a decade. And eventually, women and Black folks were allowed into the union, but even so, Black people were still segregated, so they were forced to have their own like local chapters and couldn't really join these white spaces until much like later time. And they also endorsed the Chinese Exclusion Act, much like other white labor unions during this time. They very much so used Chinese and other Asian folks as scapegoats. So, as in, they were coming, like these Chinese immigrants were coming and taking their jobs. And there's the sentiment is still like it's seen across different movements, such as the United Farm Workers movement with Cesar Chavez. So there's a couple of systems of oppression that are working like within this organizing space. So first off, there is a lot of like Mexican hegemony, because Cesar Chavez is like a Mexican American, and he's seen as, or he's commonly talked about as like the founder of UFW, despite him being a co-founder. It was very much like it was a multi-ethnic it was a multi-ethnic action in order to like succeed in gaining these rights for farm workers. And the co-founder is a Filipino organizer, Larry Itliong, and he receives very little credit despite being the co-founder. Like in history, or in my in my high school history classes, or like even like dating back to elementary, I never really learned about him. I rarely even learned about Dolores Huerta, and that also attributes to the sexism that was happening within this, or is embedded within these organizing spaces. And Cesar Chavez also carried a lot of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments. A lot of his like union campaigns revolved around undocumented folks stealing their jobs and breaking their strikes, because every time that the farm workers were on strike, then they'd have immigrants come from like oftentimes Mexico to like take over for the labor like during those days that they were on strike. Um, and one campaign that Cesar used was the illegals campaign, and there's another one called El Malcriado. So El Malcriado was a newspaper that was used to talk about any like union work or actions that were happening, but it was also used to create this anti like undocumented sentiment. So there was a lot of like, oh, people from Mexico are coming into the US and they're stealing our jobs and we need to get rid of them. So Cesar Chavez, he did work a lot with like border patrol in order to deport many undocumented people like within the area. And along with that, like in general, many like Black, Indigenous, POC women or people of color are, or women of color are often like left out of these discussions in regards to organizing, despite the fact that very much so it's like Black queer women who are out here like setting the blueprint for these movements to succeed. It's mainly men that often like take the credit for the work that they do. And another discussion question is, what are ways in which we can combat these oppressive systems, and why is it so important that we do so, that we get rid of these systems of oppression within these like labor movements that are supposed to be fighting for like everyone's liberation? And I'll give that like a couple of minutes as well, so folks have time to put their thoughts out. Okay, I'm gonna keep going with the presentation, but if anyone has any thoughts, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm gonna give some quick statistics on like why we need these movements that make space for queer, BIPOC, and women. And so in 2018, 25% of women were, or yeah, 25% of folks in unions were women, and 28% of people within the union were Black. And just to keep going with these stats, Latinas make 55 cents for every dollar that a white man makes. Indigenous women make 60% of for every dollar that white men make. Black women make 63 cents for every dollar that white men make. And white women also get paid like less than what white men do. And there is no, I guess, like official statistic for trans and gender nonconforming folks, but there are stats that talk about how the percentages of people that live below the poverty line. And for Latinx trans folks, 28% of them live in poverty, and for Black trans and gender nonconforming people, it's as high as 34%. So I think that's why it's so important for us to like fight against these systems of oppression within labor organizing spaces. It's often queer, Black, Indigenous, women of color that are the most like marginalized and are the most exploited when it comes to like honestly like any like section of life, but especially labor. And there are movements that have been centering their voices. And the first one that I want to highlight is Ni Una Menos, which began in 2017 and is dedicated to fighting gender inequality. Along with that, the abuse and murder of like women, of like feminicides. In 2017, uh, and from January to November in 2017, around 245 women were victims of femicides, and this was just in Argentina. Along with that, like Argentinian women have higher rates of unemployment and make up most of the informal employment, just like women in like almost every other country, especially Latin America. In 2018, there was a call for an international women's strike. So the point of this was, as like the graphic says, if like women stop working, then the world stops. It's similar to the 2006 like immigrant strike that there was like undocumented people are essential to like the workforce. If they're not working, then like productivity will fall. And Ni Una Menos was trying to, I guess, like replicate that in a way. Some of their demands in terms of like labor organizing were higher and equal salaries uh, to their like the men, and it was to end any like informal labor or to provide protections for what is considered informal labor. They were fighting for longer parental leave, and they also were fighting for effective accountability slash persecution in cases of like workplace violence, discrimination, etc. And during this strike, they were countering the male-dominated labor movement in Argentina and the government as well. Recently, the Supreme Court of Argentina, they made a decision to only allow state-recognized unions to strike. So anyone that wasn't part of a union that would go on a labor strike, then that was considered like illegal, and people could have serious repercussions or consequences for doing so. And women are often, as the previous stat showed, women make up most of the informal labor and are often like not in unions or not welcome in unions. So even though they are the most exploited in Argentina and pretty much like the rest of the world, they, with this court case, they wouldn't really be allowed to do much about it, at least in terms of striking, which is why they decided to do this like this international strike to like as to really go against that like male dominated field. And in this image, it says derechos laborales para las trabajadoras sexuales, which is like labor rights for sex workers. The Ni Una Más movement, they really centered the voices of like Black and brown folks in Argentina, despite Argentina being like a very like white space, a very like racist country as well. But many of the voices centered were like queer voices. There was a lot of like lesbians and trans folks that were speaking at these rallies. And there was also a lot of sex workers that were out there fighting for the same things plus more, such as sex work being recognized as actual work. Another labor movement that I wanted to talk about was the sanitation strike, which I've been mentioning throughout the presentation. And this happened in like 1968. February 1st, two Memphis garbage collectors were crushed to death because the garbage truck was malfunctioning, and the state or the city didn't really do much about it. They were very like indifferent to the two deaths. So the workers decided to like over, I believe 700 workers actually came to a union meeting and they decided to go on strike February 11th. MLK was actually a very strong supporter of the sanitation workers going on strike. And March 18th was the first time that he actually went to like march with them. And March through April, that entire month, they were still striking, they were having sit-ins, and there was a lot of cases in which the police or the National Guard would show up to like break the strike. And it wasn't until April 16th that the union was actually recognized by the city. But this is a very iconic picture. I've seen it in many like of my classes, and they're all like wearing or holding the sign that says "I'm a man," simply because the state nor the actual like business, they didn't actually recognize these workers as human beings. They were very much like dehumanized and only seen as like a form of labor or a form of profit. And lastly, I'm gonna play a short video. It's about like 4 minutes long, I believe, on the Domestic Workers Alliance.
¿Y ahora tú qué tienes? ¿Qué? ¿No me vas a hablar?
No puedo, estoy muerto.
When I saw the movie Roma, I saw myself and I said, this is what I do, this is my life.
¿Qué haces? Ya dime.
No puedo, estoy muerta.
Even though the movie was set in the 1970s in Mexico, I am one of over 2 million domestic workers who face similar struggles in the United States today. Roma is sparking a much needed conversation about the value of domestic work. The reality is, 1 in 4 domestic workers live in poverty because we were excluded from minimum wage and overtime protections. We suffer abuse from employers behind closed doors because we have been excluded from the basic workplace protection against discrimination and sexual harassment. This is 2019 America. It's time for change. These injustices are rooted in the legacy of slavery. In the 1930s, when other workers were gaining labor protection under the New Deal,
guarantee to labor adequate pay and proper conditions of work.
Lawmakers in the South specifically excluded domestic workers from those labor rights. They didn't want to give an inch to their own black employees, and they didn't see women's work in the home as being real work. As for coloring, I've been a nanny for over 18 years. I migrated from St. Lucia, where I worked with the Attorney General. Beautiful. I was hired to take care of the children, but I had to clean the bathrooms, I had to dust, I had to mop with no extra pay. Years ago, one of my employers left dog poop for me to pick up. I said, no, this has gone far enough. I continued speaking up, and eventually, I was fired.
Y las olas eran muy grandes.
There's a scene in the movie Roma that spoke to me. The scene where the family's at the beach. The main character, Cleo, the domestic worker, cannot swim. But when the children strayed too far into the ocean, she didn't think for 1 second. She went in after them to save them. She put her life on the line. I put my life on hold. I didn't have kids to take care of the kids of the families I worked with. The 1930s are over. We're calling on Congress to pass the first National Bill of Rights for domestic workers. It provides us with safe and healthy working conditions, paid sick leave, paid overtime, freedom from sexual harassment and discrimination, fair scheduling practices, and more. We've already passed laws like this in 8 states and the city of Seattle. To those watching from Congress, I urge you to follow the lead of Senator Kamala Harris and Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who are co-sponsoring the first national bill. Think back to the domestic worker that raised you, the domestic worker that's currently cleaning your home and watching your kids. They are the ones that make it possible for you to go to work. Think about how you would feel going into work with no worker rights.
Okay, and this person is part of the the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and as she was saying, like this is very, as they were saying, this is very much rooted in like anti-blackness, and it's rooted going back into the days when slavery was legal. The the National Domestic Workers Alliance is actually like an organization that formed from the National Domestic Workers Union, which was led by Dorothy Bolden. She was actually also a domestic worker, like at a very young age. I believe she was like younger than 10 for sure. And she, like, as soon as she grew up, she started going into like civil rights activism. While she was fighting segregation, she was gaining skills that she'd use for her labor organizing. And she organized like a lot of domestic workers into this. Most of them were Black workers, but nowadays a lot of them are like immigrants. In 2020, over 90%, over 90% of domestic workers are women. Over 50% are Black, Indigenous, like women of color, and about 40% ish are immigrants. But the site that I was getting these statistics off of said that the percentage of immigrants is actually most likely to be higher. And the as the person in the video was saying, the domestic workers bill of rights that they're hoping to pass in Congress would establish workplace rights and protections that other areas of labor already have. And this image is the top image is a picture of Dorothy Bolden, a Black organizer who's often forgotten when talking about labor history, like in the United States. And the bottom picture is a picture of the washerwomen that were on strike in Atlanta during 1881. During this strike, over, I believe, like 3,000 workers were like on strike for this. And as most of these like labor strikes were organized for was due to like poor living conditions, like poor living wages, or having no living wages. And to this day, like many folks are still fighting for the same rights. That is the end of my presentation. I don't want to keep you all too long, but this is a survey link and it's a chance to be entered in an opportunity drawing. The tiny URL is tinyurl.com/labor move survey. I won't disclose what the like actual opportunity is, but here's the opportunity for y'all to actually enter. Um, in a couple days, I will also be emailing everyone that registered a document full of resources that I used to to find information for this presentation, with a lot more like academic books and journals that we actually have access to thanks to being UCSD students. But yeah, I'm gonna leave this up here for like another minute or two so folks have the opportunity to scan it. And it'll also like let me know how I did in this presentation, for like it's just general feedback, so that when I have like another presentation to do, it can be better for y'all or like fit your accommodations. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope y'all learned a lot, and I'll make sure to provide those additional resources.